Welcome to That's Lit, the Lightbox podcast. We're a venture capital firm based in Mumbai, investing in consumer businesses in India. On this podcast, we're going to be talking about all things consumption, culture, and technology. Our idea is simple: we love to learn. Come learn with us. Together, we'll dig into new ideas, new ways of thinking, and new approaches to solving problems from industry experts across various fields. We hope you enjoy it. Okay, welcome to our next episode on That's Lit. Our guest today is Ambarish Kenghe, or AK, and we are going to talk to him about product. AK has been with Google for over a decade, and with a small left turn to Myntra for a couple of years in between, also heading product there. He was at Google for the rest of the time. At Google, he was PM at Google TV. He co-founded and led product at Chromecast, and most recently has been responsible for Google Pay, which is probably the most ubiquitous payment platform in India today. So, welcome to the podcast platform. Welcome to the podcast, AK.
Thank you, Sid.
Okay, so I've been wanting to ask you this for a while. So let's start by asking you, what are some of your favorite product launches in the last few years, outside of your own?
Oh,
I'm so putting you on the spot.
Hello and welcome to That's Lit, the Lightbox podcast where we talk about the things that make you go,
So I think I'll get to the last few years. The one that still continues to amaze me, it's like the kid in me thinking, the airplanes fly and that's a big deal. But I won't go that far back. But I think the smartphones still continue to amaze me. That launch is still like I'm still getting over that shock. In the last decade, and by 2010, I thought like the story had played out, and I started working actually on TV streaming devices. But it's still like it's quite profound the kind of impact it has, and I still grapple with it. But in the last few years, the couple of things that I think are promising, and I won't go into specific brand names and stuff, but the couple of product areas that are very very interesting is one is all these sort of health tracking devices that you're seeing with different companies, but specifically sleep tracking and being able to understand your sleep patterns better, how much REM sleep you had, how much deep sleep you had. And if you get a chance, I'll tell you why I get fascinated by that. So that's been sort of a big deal. The other set of devices that is very early set in their progress, but very interesting, is devices that are starting to sort of, you can program to read your mind, right? You're able to, you can start communicating without having to type, with just the thoughts in your mind. And those devices I think would become more interesting. I'm not going as far as sort of Neuralink, which is very invasive, but that's interesting. But there are devices that are not as invasive and can actually read your thoughts. You can start typing, and that human machine interface, which has not evolved I think for a while. There is mouse, there is keyboard, there is voice, but could it get faster? And that's quite fascinating for me.
So I think I would love to kind of get a little deeper on that as we kind of go down, because I don't think I'm aware of how that would even work without being invasive.
Yeah.
That'd be really interesting. What what are some of the things that took you aback, like made you say, "Oh wow, I didn't think that was going to work"? Like, are there some stuff that you just underestimated the power of when they launched, but you know positively impacted you later?
I mean, some said actually are products that I launched or was part of. But let me first get
No,
out
but
of that.
even those, but even you go ahead with those as well. If they surprised you.
Even Chromecast, right? When we launched Chromecast, we thought we had weeks of inventory, and we sold out in hours. And we knew, like, that's the thing with products, right? You built it with your with your sweat and sometimes blood, and you want them to be successful, but you're never sure, and you can never fully estimate how well they'll do or how poorly they'll do. And with Chromecast, we're definitely surprised because we just like sold out before we could figure out, and the next few weeks we were trying to get inventory. So that's one which was interesting. I think the other ones that have surprised, I mean, in some ways, Google Pay, UPI has been very surprising. Again,
Yeah.
we expected it to do well, but this kind of trajectory, if somebody says they had expected, I think I'd say, look, I can't imagine you expecting that kind of trajectory. So both of those uh, very surprising on how well they've done. And just going back to sort of my fascination with mobile phones, but how well that ecosystem has done. I think everybody predicted it will sort of be a boom, create an amazing thing, but nobody created this sort of fundamental thought of this kind of a fundamental shift that we'll just carry it everywhere we'll go, including our bathrooms.
Yeah.
At least I don't think anybody imagined in this big a way.
No, in fact, the payment stack in India, I think it would be my answer to this question. I'll be honest, and which is
Mhm.
why I kind of asked the question to begin with. It's I mean, we've been doing investing in this country for 8 years, 9 years now, and I don't think anything has had as big an impact on the country as much as how payments are being able to get done today. And when they launched, it just seemed like so much scoffing was happening about it. So I'm really excited to kind of get an insider's point of view on how things kind of developed, and I think we will. But I wanted to kind of start off by talking to you a little bit about Chromecast. Would it be fair to say Chromecast was your first large product management assignment? Google TV, would that be something similar, or do you think this was your first time like getting out in the world with this?
I think, look, I mean, depending on which, in terms of my personal sort of product assignments, depending on what you look at, worked on a bunch of stuff in Cisco back in the day. But I think if you look at product management gigs, Google TV was a pretty large, complicated product actually to launch. And so that was good. So
Google TV.
a lot of my
Yeah.
learning happened in 2010, like on Google TV with working with a bunch of folks. And a lot of that learning and unlearning played into Chromecast. So Chromecast ended up being that product where I probably had more control over things of how they were designed, um, how they could go.
So take us through that a little bit. So you're going to start this off. You co-founded it, right?
Yep.
Internally, and
Yep.
so there was nothing, and you've come in. They want to do this. It's very different. It's very unusual. Um, you're the product. You're in charge of the product. Where do you start? What did you focus on first? How did you go about thinking through this?
Yeah. So I think first place, I feel like all ideas have to start with some pain somewhere. I think some sort of a pain point has to be there, and in this case, I think a couple of things. Right, one is that I wanted to work on something new, and this idea was somewhat around at Google that you could build something like this, but nobody had productized it in this way. And I said, look, can I? And nobody had built hardware at this scale, at least within Google at that time. And so the way, at least I thought about it, is if you look at it, go back now, I'm taking you back all the way to 2011. And smart TVs were not sort of as ubiquitous, but HDMI enabled TVs were around. So there was a large number of TVs which had flat screen and HDMI input, but they were not smart to be able to stream things. And this, I think the streaming providers were starting to come up, but they were not scaling as much because TVs were not ubiquitous, which were smart. So the first idea was like, could you make like non-smart TVs smart? And that's sort of okay. There's a pain point that these TVs, you can't really. And people were using all kinds of things, right? I don't know if you remember S video cables. S video
Yeah,
cables
yeah, I remember.
laptop, and then they connect to the TVs. Like there were all kind of solutions around, and I've used those solutions. As it's very painful to do that, and you didn't want to do that. So that pain point said, look, can you build something fundamentally better? So that was one. Second thing was that could you build something that is not very expensive? Because lots some of the other solutions that you could think of or even close to this were very expensive. These devices could cost you hundreds of dollars, and price points matter. And sometimes things don't take off because they're very high price point. So the idea was, could you build something that was within a certain price point? And the third was a bit of my fascination, that we should build a small device that can plug directly into the TV. And the thought was that, could you sell it in checkout aisles? Could the supply chain be easier because it's a smaller device? And also, which was a real problem, that you don't have space on your entertainment center. There were so many devices, like somebody had a gaming station and a
Console, yeah.
cable box and an audio receiver and all these things, and you didn't have another space to keep a box in there. And the last thing that we thought about is that, not only did you not have space, you didn't have another plug point where you were, because you
Right.
had this extension thing and you have all of those filled up. The idea was, could you just get power from the TV? And those are all the things that came together. The beauty of, I think, at least for me, for Chromecast, was that I hadn't really developed hardware before that, and I didn't know as much about hardware, about the development process, how much time it could take, and that was a huge advantage. Not knowing something, you ask a lot of why nots. Like, why can't you do it this way or that way? And I think we ended up bending a lot of quote unquote rules that allowed us to move fast and launch this product fast.
That's really interesting. And we've heard this a few different times where the lack of experience was actually a massive advantage. Can you give us an example of something that you guys did with Chromecast? And I assume the fact that you plug it into a USB versus having a box is one of those things that someone who understood hardware might not have done or might not have gone down that road. Are there things that you did with Chromecast that happened because of you and the team's lack of experience, perhaps with hardware?
I would say everything. I'll give you a few examples.
Yeah, please give us a few examples.
For example, building something that small that sat behind the TV. I think the first question you would have as an intelligent person is that, would Wi-Fi ever reach it? Because the TV will act like a shield, and it is so close to sort of all this metal. And how will it even work? Like, how will you ever work? And this is doing video streaming. This is not like getting text. So how do you make something like that work? That's number one, right? If I was expert, I would probably say, look, this is a fool's errand. Don't do it. Number two, right? It's such a small device streaming video at a sort of HD UHD rate. Uh, Heat is a real problem, right? The CPU gets heated up, and the CPU goes up to like 105 degrees Celsius at times, right? Now I don't know where it goes today. I've not been close to the Chromecast hardware, but you would think, like, such a small device, like, why do you want to build a small device that can't, because you can't fit a heat sink in there, right? It's such a small device, the heat sinks are very large. So how are you going to sink heat and make it work and last it longer? That sort of another thing that, if I had known better, I would not have gotten into it. The third one was just the price point at which we are trying to sell it, right? I mean, there was no other device that was at that price point in that time. And if I knew better, I would say, no, you can get to that price point, because I would have started adding up what I knew, and nothing would have added up. The equations weren't adding up, and initially they were not adding up for us either. Same way, the timelines, right? We start, and this device was built in the fastest time anybody could think of a hardware being built. So over and over again, we kept asking, why can't you do a certain way? And the funny thing, Sid, is that when you ask this question, when you say why not, to someone who's very smart in that area, they feel that you know something that they don't know, and they think harder and solve the problem for you. And that was the most surprising thing for me,
Yeah.
that when you ask intelligent people in the industry why not, they actually solve things that they thought they couldn't.
Okay, let's move to Google Pay, and how. Again, I want to. I'll be excited to kind of hear the origin stories there, and maybe you can kind of start us off with that. You've moved back to Google for
I
Google
did,
Pay, right?
yes.
So, are they pitching? Are they sitting there pitching Google Pay to you, saying, "Look, this is what's going on," or is that how you got
No, it
enticed to
was
come back?
this was a sort of very organic sort of process where, um, Caesar, who's actually left Google more recently. He and I kept talking back and forth for probably a couple of years, and I was very excited by overall, how he approached product and how he works with people, and of course, always excited by everything that Google's doing. And then he explained to me on what was going on and the potential for what could happen. When I joined Google Pay, it was fairly small, but he had that vision, and I could see that that vision can pan out, and this kind of scale can happen. And that just excited me to come back, because the amount of impact I could create just seemed like many folds more. So that's what prompted me to come back.
What was that? So I guess when you were thinking through the idea of Google Pay, what is this now? 4 years ago, I
Yeah,
would
but
say, right?
so I wasn't there. To be clear, on Google Pay, I wasn't there at the beginning. Beginning, I think I was talking to Caesar during that
Right.
time, but not at Google Pay in the beginning. But I know, sort of. I'll give you what the sort of a sense of what's going on. Google Pay launched in September of 2017, so it's about 4 years back. But I think the thought process has to start much before that. So the team that was working on this, quite a phenomenal team that had started working on it at least a couple of years before it actually launched. And they were very thoughtful about it, and uh, not rushing into it. They were also communicating with NPCI, other folks, and helping build the ecosystem around it, and make sure that something like UPI, play their part in making that successful. The key that I found with this team was very mission driven, very focused on making payments simple, inclusive, and then creating a lot of sort of economic opportunity around all of us. And that I think mission driven, passionate thing, where people are not thinking of anything else, they're just saying, look, this thing we have to make big. And that was quite cool. So that's one thing that was very unique on how the team was thinking about. And the other thing is they were willing to.
I'm sorry. At this point, the team
The
is
team
still
is still Days.
Days,
Yeah,
right?
that's right.
Is
I mean,
this?
it was launched
Yeah.
as Days, not Google Pay. You're right. The team was still Days, and they're thinking about, in those times they could see that, look, what, a large number of payments will become digital, and it can create things that you can't imagine. And so one way to look at digital payments is, you could just say, look, what, I said I paid you some money over a digital means. The other way to look at it is, it is actually transcending time and space, in a way which is very interesting, in the sense that I don't have to be at the same time at the same place with you, and that enables use cases that otherwise couldn't happen. And the team understood that, and was willing to take a bet on something like that. So I think one way to look at a digital payment would be, said, I paying you 1,000 rupees, and over a digital medium, and that's one way of sort of looking at it blandly. The other way of looking at it is that we are transcending time and space when we make that payment, because me and you don't have to be at the same place at the same time when we make that digital payment. And that just enables a number of use cases that otherwise weren't possible. Something like, I have to pay somebody before they show up. I shouldn't have to visit them and make that payment. So all kinds of e-commerce use cases, lots of digital purchases, all of that is possible, because everybody has that power to make digital payments. So that's sort of become, and that kind of, having that kind of vision, early on, as we're talking about in the beginnings of Google Pay, the team had that vision, and truly believed in it, which is sort of what has brought it this far.
And so you now come in. You've now been running products for several years, right? Whether that's at Google, or even at Mintra, for 3 years. You come into this. How are you now looking at this? Talk to us a little bit about the philosophy that you follow, and the focus on where, when you're developing products, where do you focus? What do you think about, after having so much experience and so many years behind you?
Yeah, I think, especially when you come into an established team that is doing things, I think one of the biggest, things that is important is having the trust in the team and respecting the team for what they've done. And that's very critical when you're trying to lead a team that is doing phenomenally well. It's a rocket ship. So you just want to make sure that you don't disturb things in ways that are not supposed to be disturbed. In fact, one dot that connects in my mind is that uh, sometimes you say a good guide is one who misguides the least. So the first focus is on not misguiding. Suddenly don't try to change the world around you while not knowing what's happening. So the first important thing is understanding it and understanding it deeply as you're trying to lead. But I think where you pivoted your question in the middle there was about just thinking about my product philosophy, and a lot of it jives with other people that I work with who are super super smart. But a few things that I look for is, one, just understanding the problem that we are trying to solve, and is it really the problem? Any problem that you're looking at, big or small, what is really the problem? Sometimes we end up solving the wrong problems. And my classic story on that one is the faster horses fallacy. I don't know, Sid, have you heard of the faster horses fallacy?
No, no.
Okay, so then I think people say that if Henry Ford back, and I think this is just a story that's attributed to him, is that if he had gone back in the day and asked people what should he build, they would have
Oh,
said
yeah,
build faster horses.
faster
They
horse.
would have
Right,
said
right.
faster horses because that's what they knew. They didn't know there could be an automobile that could be built, and if he had built faster horses versus an automobile, our lives would have been different. And the point is that he understood the problem more deeply. He said it's not that they want faster horses; they want a faster way to travel, something that is easier to maintain, something that is cheaper, and that's what he built. So that's one very key aspect of at least my product philosophy, and saying, look, can we not build faster horses and build really problems that solve the pain point? The other sort of, once you've done that, the second part that I think a lot about is getting the basics right. And in fact, I've more recently, somehow this came to my mind, and so more recently I've started talking to people about it, is don't get into SOS, the shiny object syndrome. So a lot of times, instead of getting into and focusing on the basics, like we get into, hey, you know what, can we develop a feature that will look great in a demo, but it doesn't really solve the real problem. So if you're doing a flying car, the seats, yes, they're important, but don't focus on the seats, don't focus on the paint, don't focus on how it looks. It's got to fly. If it doesn't fly, there's no point. So you have to, in every product, figure out what is this flying part, right, and make sure that part is efficient, that's going to work. So that's very important. As you go around that, then you say, look, what else do I add around it? And very critical, a lot of time you'll hear that PMs are not product managers but priority managers. It's getting the priorities right, and getting this importance of less is more. That is very critical. And the last thing I'd say on, and there are lots and lots of things that I think about, but at least for this, the last thing I'd say on the product philosophy is thinking about breaking the clutter. You can build a great product, but if nobody knows about it, then it's not helpful. So you have to figure out what is your go to market strategy. How would people know about it? Will they hear it from other people, or are you going to market in a certain clutter breaking manner, or something else that you do, so that more and more people can come to know about it and can get benefited from what you build.
Okay, so we're going to come back to that. One of the things I definitely want to talk to you about is launching products, which is, I think, what you is your go to market strategy. But can you talk to us a little bit about less is more, and how that was, how Google Pay got influenced in that manner by, by what you were doing?
Yeah, the
I
good
bring this
news.
up only because, as much as this is a great philosophy within Google, this is not an Indian philosophy. In India, more is more, less is not more, and so it's really, I think, we're also learning, how things are done by watching a lot of times, and so I think this is something that's, I think we need to learn more of, just as a cultural thing.
Yeah, well, actually, if you go far back in the Indian philosophy, if you really go, or the Indian way, then less is more was always true.
That's actually true.
It's
Yes.
like, if I go into Hindi, right, "Sai utna dijiye jame kutum samaye," is, just thinking about, just give me enough so that I can take care of my family. I don't want more beyond that. So there was always about sort of simplicity and less. But again, with products, maybe we have changed. But going back to sort of the Google Pay example, the good news is that I think the team generally at Google. I mean, if you look at the Google search page, that's just the sort of that just tells you that how Google thinks about things being simple. And there were search engines before that, and how they were versus how Google has been always. So that's been sort of very interesting, just looking at that page. But Google Pay itself always had that philosophy of being simple, and I just had to carry it forward. And it's hard. One way that has been epitomized in Google Pay is that our UX was from the beginning this entity based thing. We always thought about, solving the problem, right? When you try to pay someone, the first thing you're trying to do is not the amount, not how you will pay. You're saying, who am I trying to pay? Who is the most important problem? So therefore, it was entity based. And then you think about amount and then how you will pay and all of that stuff. So we fully focused on that. And that resulted in it being simple anyway. And that wasn't my invention, it was already there. The key thing which was hard to do, and I think we've tried to do, is as you add more and more use cases. We added bill payments and recharges, you add merchant payments, you add spot to it. So you start adding more and more things. How do you still keep it simple and throw away certain things as you go along? Because if you keep just adding, it won't work. And it's very hard. In general, and Sid, you know this and probably heard this also, is that 20% of the features are used 80% of the time or by 80% of the people. That 80/20 rule applies so well in product. But we forget that and keep adding stuff. And when we add stuff, it actually, the product becomes worse, because two things happen. One, and maybe three actually. One is that it becomes too complicated, so the user can't figure out where to focus. If you do eye tracking studies, in your labs or something, it'll be very hard. They don't know where to focus, so they don't know what to do, and therefore they're confused and they can't do anything. So by doing everything, you've done nothing. Second thing that happens is that the architecture itself for the product becomes complicated just technologically, and therefore you'll find more bugs, and it's not going to work as smoothly, it may not work as fast and stuff like that. And the third thing is, when you really want to add that thing that really makes a difference, now you have a log jam, because you have so many things in there that you can't easily add this new thing that would have made a huge difference to your product, but you just can't add it. So in general, always ask yourself, can you do without it? And one of the key things that I think about, and a lot of time I'll push my product managers on it, on when we talk about min viable product, is I would say, look, okay, fine, this is not your min, so this is your min viable product, right? It has A, B, C, and D. Imagine you're launching tomorrow morning and D is not ready. Will you launch or will you not? And if your answer is you will launch, then D is not part of your min viable product. And you have to sort of think really hard about it and keep reducing versus continuing to keep adding. And a lot of times you add because you're not sure what will work. And you have to take a bet. By not taking that risk, you're taking the biggest risk.
Very, yeah. Okay, let me take this a little bit further. So let's say you want to add something, and then you ask yourself, can I do without it? You say, no, I can't do without it. And you launch, right? One of the things that you said in one of your interviews was that once you launch, you want, whether it's the merchants or the end users, you want to watch your users very carefully to see the use cases that they're doing to your product.
Mhm.
Now, we've heard others say that as well. Can you walk us through what you're watching for, and also perhaps a couple of examples of things that, in Google Pay's case at least, you saw users doing that you didn't realize was what you hadn't thought of, and it's become core to the experience?
So first, and the first part of your question said on how what you monitor, what you look for. Uh, in general, I think the good product managers have experiments sitting inside all their products and features. So they will always sort of either have ABCD arms or A or B that they would test with, because they would have done user studies, but till they see with millions of users using it, they wouldn't believe those user studies. So that's one, that they're just looking for this or that. I tried giving you this kind of a treatment in the UX versus that, and what are you clicking more, what are you liking more. So that is just one, just thinking about experimentation and watching different options. The second piece of it is that as you're, and these are all things that I'm sure everybody's listening to this knows, but I'll repeat that anyway, is as you're rolling out things, you're rolling them out. You're not suddenly going and giving it to everyone. You say, look, let me give it to one person, then let me get to two, then let me get to 10. And you have to monitor it, because sometimes what works at 1% doesn't really work at 10%. And there are also times when something that works at 10%, even at scale, doesn't fully work at 100%. So that having that kind of a sort of rollout and watching for that, that is very critical. Three is having your hypothesis around which features you thought, how would users behave and where they'd click or what they'd use more, and having that data very clearly, uh, and then tweaking and saying, look, I thought they were going to use this feature more, but they ended up using that more. And clearly, even though I'm trying to push my where, let's give users what they want, and measuring various aspects of it. I think that is very critical as well. Now, in terms of users surprising you, I think they'd surprise you all the time, because stuff that you think will work great sometimes doesn't work great, and then other things just take off. In some ways, I think what's in fact, we used to have a feature for example, proximity payments, where you could be next to each other and make a payment. Now people use that, but with COVID, everything else happened,
Hello.
and then that's not that's not the thing people are using, because they are not next to each other. So sometimes what surprises you is also how the world changes, because you can't control that, and therefore, as a product manager, you're very, very, very focused on how the world around you is changing, how the user's behavior is changing, because not only can the world change like COVID did, but also when you get a new cohort, new set of users, right? When you there are inflection points where you've gone beyond the set of initial users. Suddenly, the new set of users may want slightly different things, and maybe impacted by something else. So you have to continuously keep looking at that and looking at your data, and create experiments, and that can then create the impact for the users.
So I want to just come back to something you mentioned about how to measure this. As you look at a product and you're deep into either post launch or and whatever part of the you are on rolling out a product, how what are your key growth metrics that you measure for success? What are you looking at?
So these are very basic. I mean, said, I think some of these are very basic, and some of these will depend on the product. So one of the sort of most critical metrics that everybody uses and works quite well is just looking at your monthly active users and saying, look, okay, how many monthly active users do you have? That just, I think it's a metric that has stood a test of time. I'm sure VCs look at that a lot. Across the board, that is something that is very good. Now, then you start dissecting it, and you say, look, it's not just about monthly, how many users are coming to you weekly, how many are coming to you daily, because that tells you the frequency of usage. And then you start cutting it by, okay, what is your ratio of daily to weekly or daily to monthly, because that starts telling you how much of your base is really like frequent users or not. So that overall sort of just gives you a very good sense of what is happening. Now, when you go a bit further, you have to start thinking about retention. And there, I like, and I think other folks use that as well, is I like what I call the L curves, because there's always some drop.
Yeah.
So essentially, what you're looking at is you're looking at weekly or monthly retention by cohorts, and saying, look, people joined me on this day, people who signed up on this day, what is their, how many of them came back a month later, were still with us a month later, how many of them were with us 2 months later. And you can do that on a weekly and a monthly basis, because if you see that changing by cohorts and say, look, earlier users were more retaining, or new users are retaining more, did we change anything in the product, is this anything changing about the environment or the users? So that's something to look at, because those L curves can tell you a lot. Some other companies would look at something like a D7 retention. A lot of gaming companies would do that, where you say, look, did they come back on the seventh day? And that tends to be an interesting metric because day of the week matters, and therefore you say, look, people who joined on this day, are they coming back on the seventh day? The other metric that I've seen, which is also interesting for frequency, is to think about in the last 28 days, how many times was your product used. So if it was used 10 times, then that metric would say 10. So that's on the sort of retention and frequency. And then as you start thinking about, of course, monetization, of course, you have to start looking at your, revenue, ARR, but also, of course, average revenue per user, average revenue per active user, or per user in the base. So I think you can start cutting by different things, but those in general would cover it. In the end, what I tell people is that these are sort of the basic metrics, staples kind of thing that you could look at every day or so. But then depending on your business, you would have a ton of other metrics. Like we would look at number of transactions a day, how much money is flowing through us. And there's like tons and tons of these metrics, how much, what happened, how much money was transacted in a day or not. And you can look at tons and tons of these metrics. My suggestion to people is to decide based on your business. Some of these metrics, they become your staple, and on all the other metrics, create them and put some sort of an anomaly detection and saying, look, if it moves too much, then somebody's got to look at it. Some alert will be fired, and somebody will look at it to understand why, and at least understand why. Maybe we have to do something or about it or nothing, but at least you have sort of these alerts that help you. And as the sort of business grows, you always find more and more metrics.
In the context of India, um, I guess one of the important things to measure would just be whether the transaction went through or not, because you're so dependent on uh, the not only your own product but external products owned by traditional banks, et cetera, as well, right?
Yep, of course. When reliability basics, I think just latency, reliability, all of those sort of are very sort of basic metric that lead to the compound metrics that I talked about. For example, look, speed is a feature. So looking at latency is very, very critical. Same way, I think reliability is a feature. So all of those we have to. In fact, those I am continuously monitoring on a because you don't want any of your systems to go down. So that's a thing that should be just built into, like, that goes without saying. Yeah.
So let's talk about, and you touched base on this a little bit earlier with your, your go-to market and breaking the clutter. Um, you've you've got to launch a product, right? What does it take to have a successful launch? You touched on it a little bit. I thought maybe you could go a little bit deeper on this because you've now launched many products. What does it take to launch a product successfully?
I think it only takes one thing, Sid: ownership.
Okay.
But I'll get into more detail. Really, I think what I've seen, the best people who do it well is they have such a sense of ownership about it that they are cross-checking like every little thing and making sure everything is in the right place. Because there are so many things that can break in any product launch, the smallest of the product launch you take. That ownership mindset. A lot of people say, look, product managers should have a growth mindset. I said, look, they should have an ownership mindset. Everything else will fall into place. But what it takes to launch a product, of course, that's a very, very long list of things. Having the ownership mindset, very important. But in the end, I think a few things, right? And I've touched on some of these. Is one is getting the priorities right and figuring out, look, first of all, do you have the MVP? Do you have the min viable product? It's not straightforward to say, look, whether you have the min viable product or not. This is where judgment comes in. And product management, a lot of times people will say, is not a science, right? You always see articles that just say art of product management because a lot of judgment is involved. So you have to judge whether you have the min viable product and not too much more, because sometimes you could add a lot of things to make sure you absolutely have the min viable product. But if you add too much, then that creates less possibility of a success. That's one. Second is making sure your basics work. Like if you've got a flying car, just make sure that flies. The other stuff, you're saying, look, what, I got this basics figured out. The rest of it, I know that may not be perfect. The seats are not the right leather, but fine, I think they're good enough. but the stuff that is really important, the basics, figuring out the basics of it, that is very critical. So figure out your MVP, figure out your basics, and then figure out what is your way of getting to the consumers. How will you reach the consumers? Is it that you're going to get on TV and do an advertisement, or are you going to do some performance marketing, or are you going to do word of mouth and references, where you say, look, I'll start a product and then people will refer it, and maybe you pay them for referrals, or you create some other scarcity thing where we say, look, what, only 100 people can use this product, and everybody can invite only 5 more people. These are all things that people have tried. You need to figure out two things. One is, what would work for a product of your kind, and two, very important, is, what do you believe as a product manager, what do you think will work, and what do you think will you can make work. If you truly believe in that, a lot of times I've seen, when you believe in it, you find tweaks, you find different ways in which you make it work. But that last piece is really important, and it has become more important in the last 20 years. Back in, when the app stores were just coming up, whether it's the Android Play Store or the App Store on iOS, you would not have as many apps. So if you had an app, everybody would try it out and say, hey, I've got a phone, what do I try? I got this new app. Now it's impossible to break that clutter. So you have to find new ways of doing that. For example, with Google Pay, when Google Pay launched, we had scratch cards. We didn't spend as much money on conventional marketing, and the scratch card construct was much more efficient and effective. So you have to find that for your product.
Is it, when you launched Google Pay, how did you break the clutter? What did you do?
So I was, of course, like I said, I was not there at launch, but
Well,
when the
it relaunched from Days as well. Like when
yeah, yeah,
you
that's
know,
true.
yeah, yeah.
So with initially, of course, going back to Taze, right? Taze, the clutter breaking thing was, it was very simple design. It had sort of the scratch cards, of course, the security and the fraud protection, everything else that Google brings, that all was there. So that sort of broke the initial clutter and grew it. As we sort of rebranded it to Google Pay and grew that product from there on, we've done a few things, right? We've added more use cases, but also one of the things that's been very successful is the sort of constructs that we create on the platform. For example, when World Cup was happening last, I forget now the dates, I mean 2019 summer or something, we had a game called Taste Shots, which just became very, very popular. I think it was played, I think, 600 million times, which in a matter of few weeks. So it would have been one of the biggest games in sort of India ever, if you looked at the number of times it was played. We had that. Or if you look at, we had this construct, I don't know if you remember the Rangoli game, where we had, you could
I
collect a bunch
remember
of,
that. I remember that. Yeah, yeah.
yeah. So you could do that. Now, if you look at December, we had this travel thing where COVID was there, but you could visit different cities, and that became very popular. So that's one way that we have sort of we have created a lot of growth. Second, like I said, we've added a sort of bunch of features that have added to the growth, and we are creating that sort of merchant consumer flywheel where you can we can add more merchants, as well as our competitors and partners are adding more merchants, and that creates more places to play and pay, and that has been expanding the network. We also redesigned the app, because as we realized, we said, look, this is this is this has worked so far, and now for the next game or the next level of users and scale, you need to redesign it. So because that again goes back to continuously monitoring what's working and what's not working. And even as we speak, right, I mean, I think we've got a sort of newer design coming where we'll tweak a few more things and bring something else up there. So it's a continuous process. But yes, the growth constructs that we have done continuously, the new features we've added, and just redesigned a bunch of things, that's made a big difference. And that's where things are in product, right? There are specific inflection points that make a big difference. It's not about doing 100 things.
Okay, that's really helpful. I wanted to just touch base on hiring. Hiring for a product role. I've always found this, even with our portfolio companies, become product is a very generalized term. Product managers, and if you're not a product manager, hiring for this role is complicated. Interviewing for this role is complicated, and understanding what experience is valuable, what experience might not be, what experience should we be looking for, are all things that have to be learned over time. Unlike, let's say, hiring someone in the accounts department, let's say, for example. Talk to us a little bit about how you hire for product, what you look for, and where you found very interesting places you found very cool talent.
Yeah, I mean, it's a like you said, it's tricky. Hiring in general is hard because it's very hard to test people do in an interview, because in that setting, how they behave in that setting could be very different from how they behave in real life when they have to actually do things. Both, you'll be positively as well as negatively surprised. I have very simple things that I look for. I think I mentioned I definitely try to find markers for ownership. Say, look, are you a real owner, and will you sort of feel the ownership and the weight of ownership? That makes the biggest difference. The second piece that I look for is the ability to learn and unlearn. And the way I test it, I generally ask very few questions on the past, how they did something in the past, because that's I find that that's interesting but somewhat easier to describe. But when you throw new problems in them, and a lot of times I throw problems at them that I'm grappling with and I'm considering, should I go this way or that way? And that gives me an insight into sort of how they solve problems and how they're learning suddenly a new area thrown at them. They have to get more data, or sometimes they have to even ask me questions to understand that area. And that tells you like how quickly can they get, or can they ask the right questions, learn. And the way, and unlearning is as critical or almost more critical, because when you have these strong held beliefs that you don't want to move, they can sometimes drag you down. And so I try to challenge people on things and say, look, what if this, what if that, and try to see that things that they truly believe, or during the course of the conversation they've said, look, I think this is the right thing to do. And you try to really challenge them and see how they think about that, and do they see the other aspects, the other side of the coin at all. So that learning unlearning is really important. The last point is about passion. You want to see emotion and passion, because it's not this is a hard job, and I almost think of it as a way of life. You everything around you starts bothering as a product manager. You say, look, why is this switch upside down, why is this table in this place? And then you have to prioritize. But having that passion to start with is really important. So I definitely look for that. So those are the three things that I'd look for. I'm looking for like continuously proof points in their past, proof points through sort of testing certain things that I can. But one thing that said I do after every interview that I do, and everybody who's interviewed with me knows this, is that I close my eyes and say, can I imagine reporting to this person? Am I inspired enough? Did they tell me things that I don't know? Are there things that I learned from them? And if I can say yes to that, then it's easier. Then that works for me, because that means you can get somebody who you can trust, who you can leave alone, and they can create great products.
Oh, that's a good one. I'm going to try that. I want to try that. Okay, I have time for one more last thing, and I want to bring back what you said at the very beginning of this podcast and have ended on that note. But you're excited about the how products are going to be using not your voice, not your typing skills, but your mind. What's a product? How are they going to do that without being invasive? And where does this go, real quick?
Look, this has been, it seems it's been around for a while. I mean, I have to dig it up, but I think somebody at MIT had done this helmet through which they had tweeted a few words. And this was a while back. Like, I can,
I remember this. I remember
right?
the helmet. Yeah.
Now, this was a helmet. Remember, it was a helmet. It wasn't a Neuralink or anything
Yeah,
invasive at
that's
all.
true. That's right. I
Uh,
didn't realize. I
so,
remember that.
so
Yeah.
I think so. Both, and the way my mind went to this is I'm very, everybody who's talked to me in the last year and a half knows about this, but I've been very impressed by this book called Why We Sleep. And and there he talks about how, and this sort of got me thinking about these products and the sleep products, is how in the last 5 or 6 years the technology has improved so that they can actually measure what's going inside your mind. somewhat, like what kind of signals are happening. They talk about the sleep spindles, other things that are happening inside your mind, and it seems that they're able to catch some waves. I'm not expert on sort of these waves in hardware, but and there are products out there. I think there's a product called Muse, I think, on Amazon, or the other places where you can find these products. I haven't. I need to actually. I'm looking to try some of these. Is and I don't. Again, I don't know whether they're safe or not. I think they are, but you should be able to sort of get these, understand some of these waves, based on the electrical signals inside your brain, and that, my guess is, allows you to train these devices and say, look, when you see this kind of a wave, then it means this wave means A, this wave means B, and then it could get more and more complicated. In fact, that book, it talked this Why We Sleep book, it talked about how they could sort of train people and show them images and measure the impulse. And I could show you image of a car, image of a tree, image of a diamond, stuff like that. And then when we were sleeping, if you dreamt about them, I would just wake you up and say, hey, were you thinking about a car? And they got it right most of the time, because that's sort of, they were able to read those waves. So it seems it's starting to get there. The reason it excites me, Sid, is because both this is again a very tricky area, all kinds of sort of ethical and other questions, so I don't want to get into that. But just from a pure technology and excitement perspective, it's like crazy how limiting inputting into a computer is, and how limiting it is to be able to take time to read or listen to thing or watch it, versus being able to get it right away. So I'm pretty excited. 10, 20 years from now, there'll be stuff that, if we are talking again, I'll say, look, we talked about that and now it's here.
See, now it's going to be on record. That's going to be. Is this book by Matthew Walker? Is that the right book?
You're right. Highly
Okay.
recommended. Highly recommended.
I just looked it up. Just want to make sure that in case anyone wants to read it, it's the Matthew Walker book. AK, thank you so much for spending this time with us. This was so valuable, and honest to God, I really, really enjoyed hearing some of the stories. It was really, really great. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, Sid. I definitely enjoyed the conversation. Thank you.